I'm delighted that Jeanie Ponsford is going to speak to us. Professor Ponsford, AO, is Director of Clinical Programs in the School of Psychological Sciences at Monash University and Director of the Monash Epworth Rehabilitation Research Centre. Jeanie has nearly 40 years of experience engaged in clinical work and research with adults and children with a brain injury. Can you please welcome Jeanie?
Yes, so thank you, Nick. I'm absolutely thrilled to be invited to be part of this conference, and I have to apologise in advance that I'm not staying around because I had a pre-arranged hiking trip to Tasmania, which I have to be on a plane at 3:30 this afternoon. But before that, I'm going to tell you a bit about my experience with cognitive rehabilitation after brain injury. My background is as a neuropsychologist. I'm sure there's many people in the audience who hate neuropsychologists. You'll have to forgive me for that. So I have worked since 1982 at Epworth Healthcare in Melbourne, and we do treat many people with traumatic brain injury. And we have, and so I have to, a bit like John, unfortunately, I have to acknowledge from the beginning that I've got a bit of a bias towards traumatic brain injury in my talk, although much of what I talk about will be applicable to people with brain injury due to stroke or brain tumour or other things. So anyway, when we started our brain injury program back in the 1980s, we thought it would be important to follow people up to find out how they went after rehabilitation. And this led to the our longitudinal head injury outcome study, which is much smaller than John's model systems in the US, but it's kind of been running in parallel as a single centre outcome study over the same time frame. So we've now followed up 2,900 people, around about 1,700 or 1,800 at 1 and 2 years post-injury, around about 1,300 at 3 and 5 years, over 600 at 10 years, and nearly 300 at 20 years post-injury. These people have been predominantly injured in motor vehicle or work-related accidents because the TAC and work care pay the fees of most of the patients that come into our program. They have had predominantly moderate, severe or very severe injuries. So what I'm going to be talking about really doesn't apply so much to mild TBI. So we ask our patients when they come back to this interview how they're going with various activities. And we find actually, and I know there are many early struggles with independence in personal activities of daily living, but by a year post-injury, that has usually not the main problem. We find very good outcomes. Over 95% are independent by 1 year post-injury. But there are certainly a proportion who continue to have difficulties with more complex activities in the community, such as shopping, banking, and financial management. Unfortunately, however, I see I'm not advancing these slides. I'm trying to do a double act here, so you're going to have to just forgive me with this. Unfortunately, however, a significant proportion, about half, have not returned to their previous leisure activities. And of those employed prior to injury, only about half are getting back to work. And of those who do get back to work, we find that about half are reporting that they experience more fatigue, about a quarter are reporting that they make more mistakes or have difficulty keeping up, and a proportion are also reporting difficulty getting on with people. Students who return to study also report continuing difficulties with learning new information, keeping up, and getting fatigued. We find that our patients show very high levels of mobility by and large, with only about 10% needing any aid to help with their walking by a year post-injury. But unfortunately, that's not the case with cognitive and communication issues. So we find that about 80% of our patients are reporting problems with their memory at 1 year, but still at 10 years post-injury. that problems with speed of thinking, concentrating are problems for about 60% of people, and there's a growing proportion who become increasingly aware of difficulties planning and organising things. In the realm of communication, we find about half of our patients have difficulty thinking of the right word in conversation, and about a quarter are having trouble keeping up with conversation. There are also behavioural difficulties, as John mentioned earlier, difficulty with regulating behaviour, which leads about 60% to be reporting that they're more irritable or short-tempered. And these problems are persisting over 10 years after injury. So what we conclude from all of this outcome data is really that there's a growing evidence that it's really the cognitive and to some degree the behavioural difficulties that are underpinning disability, long-term disability following traumatic brain injury. But despite that, the focus of rehabilitation has traditionally been on physical independence. And it is still the case to this day that most rehabilitation centres provide patients with 2 hours a day of physical therapy, 2 hours a day of occupational therapy, mostly focused on independence in activities of daily living, maybe half an hour of speech therapy, which might be partly focused on cognitive difficulties, and they might see a neuropsychologist maybe once a week if they were lucky. That said, there has in the last couple of decades been a growing awareness of the significant need to address cognitive impairments. As you've already seen, these impairments are largely in the domains of attention, memory, language and communication, and executive function, and following stroke there may also be significant impairments to do with vision and neglect. Historically, there have been a number of different approaches taken to addressing cognitive difficulties. There are some pharmacological interventions that have been used, for example, the use of Ritalin to increase speed of thinking. But more commonly, the interventions are more at a behavioural or cognitive level. And historically, the most common approach was a so-called restorative approach, which involves giving people training, repeated practice at doing an activity with the aim of actually restoring that activity. And that sort of makes sense because it's how we learn in school. However, more recently there's been also a significant amount of work thinking about compensatory approaches. When we heard from Kate earlier, we heard that she has really learnt to manage her memory difficulty by using, for example, her smartphone, or other people might use a diary, or people might learn so-called metacognitive strategies, so following certain steps in order to solve problems. Or there may be modifications to the environment that could be made to make tasks easier for people with brain injury. Now we have, in the last couple of decades, become increasingly aware, largely from animal studies, that providing stimulation from the environment certainly has a significant impact on the brain. It creates more rich dendritic connections and certainly is having an impact, which means that rehabilitation has potential to change the brain. And there have been some very fascinating motor studies, mostly in animals, where they've conducted systematic motor training and shown that it is possible to make changes at the level of the cortex by providing that kind of motor stimulation. And this has also occurred in the sensory realm. Unfortunately, cognitive functions are more complex than this because they're quite widely distributed in the cerebral cortex, so that when we're performing a given task, we don't exactly know which parts of the brain are being stimulated. And so, as my dear colleague Brian Culp has said, and he said it in 1995, but I know he would still say it today, and that is that although it is theoretically possible for lost functions to completely return to a plastic brain, careful behaviour analysis shows this is rarely, if ever, the case in either laboratory animals or humans. So claims of recovery must be evaluated critically, with the expectation that the most likely outcome is partial recovery of function, along with considerable substitution of function. There's also been a growing awareness that providing repeated practice on abstract tasks doesn't necessarily generalise to the real world. And this has led to a growing awareness of the need to focus rehabilitation more directly on the activities that the person needs to perform in their daily life. Doing rehabilitation also needs to be meaningful, and so it's become increasingly clear that we need to be allowing people with brain injury to be setting their own goals and working towards things that are important to them, not just setting them up in front of a computer to do some abstract activities. And we need to be embedding rehabilitation in their world and making sure that it is relevant. And we need to be evaluating the outcomes from it in personally meaningful ways. As my colleague Jim Malik has said many times, outcome is abstract, global and idiosyncratic to the individual case. So what will be a meaningful outcome will vary from one person to the next, depending on their roles, their priorities in life, their pre- and post-injury strengths and weaknesses, and their environment and supports. One method that can be used to document personally meaningful goals is goal attainment scaling, which allows you to document goals that are in objective behavioural terms, negotiate those with the client on a 5-point scale, with 0 meaning the expected outcome, +1 and +2 better than expected outcomes, and -1 and -2 worse than expected outcomes. And I'll show you some examples of the use of this as we go along. Now, also over the last 2 decades, there's been a growing focus on the practice of evidence-based medicine. So in many domains of medicine, what they have done is conduct syntheses of all of the research evidence, grade that evidence, and choosing the best quality evidence, have produced guidelines for practice in many different domains. And this has also occurred in the domain of cognitive rehabilitation. A number of groups have developed guidelines, and probably the most well-known those of Keith Cicerone, led by Keith Cicerone, who produced 3 iterations of guidelines, the most recent being in 2011. So then, since then, a group of us from Canada, Australia and the United States worked on the INCOG guidelines. So these were led by Mark Bailey from Toronto and Peter Bragg from Melbourne. So what this process involved was conducting a systematic review of the literature up to date, updating existing systematic reviews, updating existing guidelines, and grading the evidence according to its quality, and making recommendations according to the quality of the evidence. So a level A recommendation was supported by at least one meta-analysis, which is an analysis across trials, or a systematic review, or a high-quality randomised control trial. Level B recommendations were supported by cohort studies that had a minimum of having a comparison group or small randomised control trials. And Level C Level C recommendations were largely based on our expert panel opinion, which was based on their experiences through uncontrolled case studies, single case experiments, or case series. So the group of us from around the world met by electronic means for a whole day and went through all of these recommendations, and with expert opinion woven in there as well, came up with these guidelines, which, thanks to John Corrigan, were published in the Journal of Head Trauma Rehabilitation in 2014. And I apologise that they were published in 2014, and you could say, well, this is not cutting edge. But to be honest, the evidence evolves really quite slowly, and I think they are still pretty well current in their intent to this day. So there were guidelines for the assessment and management of post-traumatic amnesia and attention and speed of information processing, which I led those guidelines. Robin Tate led a guideline on the management of executive functioning. Leanne Torr, who's here in the audience, led a guideline for the management of cognitive communication difficulties. And Diana Velaconja from the United States, from Canada, led the guideline for management of memory problems. So I don't have time to go through these guidelines in all of their detail, but I thought I would just highlight some of the main recommendations and then discuss these a bit. So memory is probably the area that is most challenging for the majority of people with a brain injury from a cognitive perspective. So there was a level B recommendation that training in internal compensatory strategies, such as the use of visual imagery, making pictures in your head to help you remember lists or remember names, engaging in repeated practice at retrieving information, using certain systematic self-cueing techniques or self-talk could be effective for people with mild to moderate memory impairments. But they needed to have some degree of preservation of executive function to know what situations they should use these types of approaches in. Sorry. The level A evidence, I need someone in the audience giving me a sign when I haven't advanced the slide, sorry. And then there was level A evidence for the use of environmental supports and reminders. And these were seen as particularly appropriate for people with severe memory problems who couldn't engage in that type of visual imagery to enhance laying down of memories. But it was, and this has been supported by a number of randomised controlled trials, most specifically evaluating the NeuroPage, which was a study led by Barbara Wilson, and there's also been a couple of randomised controlled trials of the use of smartphones to support memory, showing that they can be extremely helpful. But it's been highlighted that people with brain injury and their caregivers can't just be handed a smartphone or a diary and said, go and use this. They really need systematic training in using these aids. And there needs to be very careful attention paid to the most suitable aid or strategy, considering the age of the person, the severity of their impairment, what types of memory strategies they used before they had a brain injury, their cognitive strengths and weaknesses, including their levels of executive functioning and any physical comorbidities. So it's really a waste of time trying to give an 80-year-old woman who's never used a smartphone to help her memory and expect her to adapt to these apps. Even me, it would be a bit of a waste of time, to be honest. But and then conversely, a labourer who's not got good literary skills is not going to be very likely to be making notes in a diary. So I thought I'd kind of bring this, these memory strategy research to life a bit by telling you a bit about some work that we have done in this area. So this is work that was led by my doctoral student Tony Whittile, along with Dana Wong and Renee Stolwick. And we compared the use of compensatory approaches to memory difficulties with restorative approaches. So the restorative approach that was taken this was a 3-arm randomised controlled trial involving 66 people, a third of whom had the restorative approach, a third had the compensatory approach, and a third were a waitlist control group. And these were actually stroke patients, I need to say. So Lumosity, you may have heard of. It's a commercially available cognitive training program, computerised, designed to train the brain like a muscle. So it offers games that will assist people with remembering patterns and locations, associating names with faces, working memory, and recalling sequences of objects and movements. So the people who were randomised to receive this type of memory training undertook it 3 to 5 times a week for 30 minutes at a time, and they did this over a 6-week period. So then there was the compensatory approach, which occurred in a group situation. So the participants in this arm met as a group once a week for 2 hours over a 6-week period, and there were 3 to 8 people with stroke in each group. Each of the groups contained content along 3 different dimensions. Firstly, there was education about the stages of memory and the important brain regions for memory. There was a lot of talk about strategies for memory, both internal strategies such as ways of learning names by making repetition or associations, and then there was training in using external aids depending on a given individual, such as smartphones, calendars, alarms, apps and notes and so on. And then there was a focus on lifestyle changes that might optimise memory. So optimising the organisation of your home and office environment, having exercise, eating well, minimising mood problems and stress, which we know can have a very negative impact on memory, and optimising sleep and minimising fatigue. So this randomised control trial, as I said, was conducted, and what did we find? Well, the outcomes, the primary outcome from this study was the attainment of personally meaningful goals that was set using goal attainment scaling. So people set their own goals about what they really needed to take away from this rehabilitation program. It might have been improving my ability to remember names, for example. And we found, as you can see from the left-hand graph, that the people who engaged in the memory strategy group showed better attainment of their goals both at the end of therapy and at 2-month follow-up. We had hoped that the lumosity in purporting to strengthen people's memory might improve people's performance on the cognitive, the neuropsychological measures of memory. But in fact, there were no significant group differences or changes over time in performance on the list learning tasks, the Ray Auditory Verbal Learning Test, and a visual memory task. We asked the participants in the study how they found these different interventions, and the top 3 are comments from the people in the memory strategy group, and the bottom one from the lumosity group. So the memory strategy participants said the most helpful thing about the group was the support I'm getting and the hints and tips from other people in the group. It helps me identify what's wrong with my memory and strategies to improve it. Now I feel like I can keep being independent and I don't have to go to a retirement village. On the other hand, the participants in the lumosity group were less positive, and this 65-year-old woman said, I found the exercises didn't translate to everyday life because my memory is just as bad as it always has been since the stroke. So moving on now to executive function. So this guideline was led by Robin Tate. And one of the primary recommendations was that there was level A evidence from a number of trials that supported training in so-called metacognitive problem-solving strategies. So they involved learning a series of steps to follow in order to more effectively solve problems or follow through with goals. So these took various forms. There's quite well-known version known as goal management training, or goal, plan, do, check, step-by-step strategies. These do require, however, some degree of self-monitoring and incorporation of feedback to improve future performance. So they're only going to be applicable for people who know when and how to use a strategy and can identify the context in which they need to apply it. It was also emphasised by the panel that these approaches needed to be focused on everyday problems and activities. So this is an example of the 5-step routine that is taught in goal management training. It was also recommended that it was possible to apply strategies to improve people's capacity to analyse and synthesise information in people who had impaired reasoning skills. And this was based on 2 quite small randomised controlled trials. And in the domain of self-awareness, our colleagues Jeanie Fleming and Tamara Ounsworth from Queensland have shown us through another randomised controlled trial that it is possible to improve people's error monitoring by providing systematic feedback about errors. So I thought I would bring to life a bit this, the use of goal management training by telling you about some work by my past doctoral student, Michelle Grant, who applied goal management training to executive difficulties, everyday executive difficulties that people with brain injury were experiencing. And she did this in 4 single case studies. So one of these was Tony, who was a 38-year-old man who'd had a severe TBI with frontal contusion that had caused problems with memory, attention, planning and problem solving and processing speed. He'd had 16 months of rehabilitation, including a period at our transitional living centre, and he had gone home, was living independently, he just had some home help, but he was still experiencing difficulties with budgeting and reported that he was tending to overspend when he was shopping. So Tony's overall self-set goal was to improve his weekly household shopping efficiency. So Michelle thought she'd better go shopping with Tony to find out more about how he was doing his shopping. She found that he did actually use a pre-typed shopping list and list his main meals and underline the required items after checking the pantry. He'd learnt these routines in our transitional living centre. But he didn't compare the prices of different brands when he was shopping, or purchase seasonal fruit and vegetables, or take into account the prices of each main meal, or underline all the required items on his list. And then he would often not purchase all those items, and then he would purchase a whole lot of other items that he would see in the supermarket. And the end result of this was that he was spending more than he wanted to. He was spending an average of $63 in his weekly shop, and he wanted to be spending $54. He thought that was reasonable to save himself $10 a week. So the goal, set using goal attainment scaling, was to spend no more than $54 on his weekly shopping. Michelle thought she would help Tony by setting some secondary sub-goals to underline all the items required to satisfy his meal plans and to purchase only those items and not any additional items. And they used goal attainment scaling to articulate these goals so that his weekly shopping expenditure would be between $47 and $53, that he would purchase, that he would underline 86 to 100% of the required items on his list, and that he would purchase 86 to 100% of those items and no more than 2 additional items. So the first 3 sessions she spent in theory training, so they would rehearse these steps of this goal management training, practice naming goals, breaking them into sub-goals and ordering them into a sequence, visualising carrying out that sequence, and then carrying it out and monitoring and checking that what you did was what you set out to do. The goal management steps were then applied to Tony's shopping, so they generated ideas for using advertising material to plan meals, purchasing the seasonal fruit and vegetables and home brand products, and buying substitute items that were on special. And then for homework, he would practice using the advertising material to plan his main meals for the following week. They then progressed to shopping training, and Michelle would initially provide maximal prompting, and then she withdrew that prompting. So at home they would work on planning the meals using the specials catalogue, check that everything was underlined, and visualise how he was going through all the steps at the supermarket. And at the supermarket, again, she pointed out the seasonal fruit and vegetables and specials and so on, and showed him how he could buy substitute items that were on special and check that he had purchased all his underlined items. And they, along the way, developed a new tailored shopping list that had visual prompts. So how did Tony go with all of this? Well, he did achieve his main goal of spending an average of $53.57 at the end of the intervention, and in fact continued to improve. So by the time of follow-up, he was only spending $41.99. But in terms of his secondary goals, although he did achieve these at the end of the intervention, he had regressed when she followed him up 2 months later. And what this told us was that really what was important to Tony was just to have an extra lot of money in his pocket at the end of the shopping week, and really doing what Michelle thought was a good idea was not particularly important to him. So it taught us that it's really very important to focus on what the client with a brain injury wants out of the rehab process, not what the therapist would like to achieve, and also to avoid setting too many goals simultaneously. Of course, and I hear many of you sitting here thinking, so many people with a brain injury have a great deal of difficulty actually following through with these types of steps themselves. And it is the case, unfortunately, that many people with severe brain injuries will require external modification of tasks and environmental supports. And sadly, in developing our guidelines, we found almost no examples of such interventions. So moving on now to the realm of attention and speed of information processing. I led this guideline, and interestingly, the strongest evidence actually supported a pharmacological intervention, which was the use of methylphenidate or Ritalin, which has been shown now in 4 randomised controlled trials to increase speed of information processing. These trials have been led largely by John White, but Kathy Wilmot and myself also did one trial here in Melbourne. And we then subsequently tried to roll this out in outpatients and see if we could get people returning to the community to be using Ritalin if they had problems with speed of thinking. Because methylphenidate is quite widely used in the US, but after screening 1,100 patients, after all the contraindications, which were any history of substance use or learning difficulties, and people's preferences not to take drugs, which is very much a cultural thing in Australia, we had 11 participants in the trial. So I don't think methylphenidate's ever going to take off in Australia as a treatment for speed of information processing, but it is much more widely used in the US. There were, however, also some behavioural recommendations, so that attention training in conjunction with metacognitive strategy training using functional everyday activities could be considered, especially in people with mild to moderate attentional difficulties. And this was largely based on a randomised controlled trial of time pressure management. This was led by Luciano Fazzotti and colleagues from the Netherlands. So they taught people who had slowed thinking to take managing steps ahead of performing tasks to slow down the information. So for example, if they had to be in a meeting, they might tape record the meeting or tape record a conversation if they couldn't keep up, or systematically ask people to repeat information or ask them questions for clarification. So of course they needed a degree of insight to be able to recognise when they would have to apply these strategies. And there was level C evidence recommending the use of remedial exercises combined with strategy training to aid working memory, but this was only based on a few single case studies. There's also some evidence from 2 small randomised controlled trials that it may be possible to teach people to do 2 things at once. But this will only work if the tasks that you're training them on are somewhat similar to the dual tasks that they have to perform in their everyday life. It was emphasised in this guideline, showing my own personal biases, I've got to say, this was the subject of my PhD back in the 80s, that reliance on repeated exposure and practice on decontextualised computer-based tasks was not recommended. Performing these tasks, you will get better at them, while you're doing the tasks, but the effects don't necessarily generalise to your everyday life. We also, as a panel, made a consensus recommendation that modifying tasks and the environment, such as building in rest breaks or simplifying tasks or reducing the need for speed and removing distractions from the environment, could also be effective. And despite the fact that I know that a lot of clinicians use these type of approaches, once again we found no evaluation of such approaches in the literature. So I just thought I'd tell you again some examples from some research that we've done bringing some of these approaches to life. So my then doctoral student Alicia Demowski studied 3 single cases who were reporting people, they were brain injured people who were reporting problems with attention and speed of thinking, and they each undertook both a restorative approach first and then a compensatory approach to dealing with their attention, and we wanted to see how they found each of these approaches. So the first approach was 9 hours of doing attention process training, which is another battery of tasks designed to improve different aspects of attention, and this was followed by 9 hours of strategy training. So what happened? Well, the participants all definitely got better at doing the attention process training in its various aspects. They each had individualised goals for the strategy training. So client A wanted to better make plans and follow through with them and be able to stay on task. And so he was given a to-do list and a diary to help him make his plans and follow through with them. And then there were some modifications made to his environment. Client B wanted to concentrate better at work and manage anxiety interfering with attention. So they set up a system of providing alerting tones to keep her on task at work, that these beeps would go off. There were boundaries set with interactions to sort of limit what she had to focus on at work. And then she also learnt strategies, cognitive behaviour therapy and mindfulness strategies to manage her anxiety. And client C wanted to improve his attention to better remember information and be able to pay attention during introductions. He learnt time pressure management strategies, memory strategies, and sleep hygiene and fatigue management strategies. So you can see, in fact, when you're managing attention, you're often actually really managing other things such as memory and fatigue and stress and so on in reality. So we found that as far as the individualised goals were concerned, they were mostly attained at the end of the strategy training, although participant A only achieved 1 out of 3 of his goals. But the goal attainment was generally maintained at follow-up. When the participants were asked on a self-rating scale of attention and their close others how they'd found the intervention, certainly, unfortunately, the participants themselves didn't feel it had impacted their daily life that much, but their relatives did feel that the strategy training had helped. And when they were asked how they'd found the interventions, they found both interventions enjoyable and had found they increased their confidence. But again, as I said earlier, they didn't feel they impacted their daily activities that much. One client felt that the attention process training activated his brain and he quite liked it. The others didn't like it so much. They said it made them, one said they became more anxious and restless. Mostly the strategy training was found to be helpful, and 2 out of 3 participants said that it was able to be more easily applied in their everyday life and have long-term effects. So finally we come to social communication skills, and this guideline was led by Leanne Torr. There is now quite a bit of evidence from a number of randomised controlled trials that it is possible to improve pragmatic language skills or social behaviours and the cognitive abilities required for social interactions, and this training can be successful if conducted individually or in group settings. But the panel strongly recommended that the training needed to be applied in everyday contexts to be successful. There's also emerging evidence to show that it's possible to train emotion recognition skills, which we know to be deficient in many people with traumatic brain injury. And Leon Tor has done a great deal of work, very important work, that is working with communication partners and ways other people in the environment, such as the police force, to minimise the stress on people with severe communication difficulties and thereby enhance the quality of their communicative interactions. So each of these guidelines were accompanied by an algorithm that we developed, which was designed to guide clinicians to actually use the guidelines in their clinical practice. And this is the guideline for the social communication guideline. This is the algorithm for it. So if a person has impaired communication, they have to be referred to a speech and language pathologist for assessment, but that assessment needs to be conducted in the context of considering that person's real-world demands and needs and cultural background. If they have aphasia, they need to be treated for that. If they have severe communication problems, they need to be introduced to augmentative communication devices. Everyone needs to have an opportunity to have cognitive communication rehabilitation that needs to consider their partner, their environment, the demands of their lifestyle, and that they would have individualised goals for their social communication identified, and these any interventions need to be adapted to their individual learning styles, and there could be interventions for social skills training or conversational skills training as needed, and there needs to be an emphasis on training partners, particularly for people with severe communication difficulties. Now, you will have noticed a number of recurring themes across these guidelines. Firstly, that active interventions are only suitable for people with mild to moderate impairments who have some degree of self-awareness and motivation to apply them. That we need to be setting goals and selecting strategies that are of relevance to the people that we're working with, and apply these and evaluate the outcomes in the real world. We need to also use methods of instruction that match the individual's learning ability. And of course, as I've already said, we must be ready to acknowledge that there are many individuals who won't be able to learn those types of actively applied strategies, and we need for them to work with modifying the tasks and the environment to make it easier for them to do things. And as I say, there's a huge need for more interventions in this area. So guidelines are important, but they're only as good as the research on which they are based. We found many, many limitations in the research on which we based the guidelines. They're largely based, these trials are based on small and very heterogeneous samples of patients. Many of the studies had a high risk of bias, which means that the people evaluating the outcomes were the same as the people who delivered the interventions. There are, of course, many challenges in maintaining rigorous research design standards in the realm of cognitive rehabilitation. Our patients are very variable, not only in the nature of their brain injuries, but also in the types of cognitive impairments they've had, but also what they bring to the injury, their levels of ability, their motivation, the demands of their lifestyle, the kinds of supports that they have in their environment. And of course, most of these people have many different problems that are all being worked on at once in rehabilitation. And it's not usually possible to stop rehabilitation for other problems while one evaluates the effectiveness of one particular type of intervention. And then, of course, we also need to be controlling for the amount of therapist support. Just having support from a therapist is going to bring about improvements in a person's functioning. The fact that most of our patients are spontaneously recovering, particularly in the first few months after injury, or up to a year or two even. And there will be practice effects on the measures, particularly, for example, neuropsychological measures that are used to assess outcomes. And unfortunately, there's a lack of agreement over definitions and criteria for measuring outcomes. Most of the interventions that we studied in the literature focused on individual cognitive functions, both in terms of training and outcome assessment. And unfortunately, those outcomes were generally measured on neuropsychological measures, which we all know fail to capture what is meaningful to a given individual. So, of course, another terribly important question is, what do clinicians know about these guidelines? Are they using them? What are clinicians really doing? So, following on from the publication of this guideline, Marina Downing, Peter Bragg and myself set about conducting a clinician survey to find out what they were doing and what they knew about guidelines. So we surveyed 221 Australian clinicians who were mostly occupational therapists, speech pathologists and neuropsychologists, and they were from all states of Australia and all quite well broadly represented. And we also surveyed 144 international clinicians. We found that the clinicians generally were using both cognitive retraining and compensatory strategies very commonly. When we asked them what they would apply these different approaches to, mostly they were using retraining approaches for addressing executive functioning and attention, whereas for memory they tended to use compensatory approaches. When they were asked what was easiest and most difficult to address, memory was the easiest to address because their clients could very often report and relate to their memory difficulties, and they also had a whole suite of options to draw on in addressing memory difficulties. On the other hand, executive functioning was the most challenging to treat because the clients wouldn't have awareness of the problem and they had such difficulty following through with any strategies to address it. Only about half of the Australian clinicians were aware of the clinical practice guidelines and 42% had used them. On the other hand, 81% of our international cohort were aware of guidelines. However, this taught us that the international clinicians were largely drawn from conference databases, and I think they were a biased sample somewhat. They'd attended conferences and knew about the guidelines. When they were asked what were the vital ingredients for success of cognitive rehabilitation, the clinicians said the most important things were having the client having some degree of self-awareness, having family involvement. 89% said that team collaboration was absolutely vital for success of cognitive rehabilitation, and goal setting was also seen as very important. And conversely, the factors that did not assist cognitive rehabilitation were a lack of insight and awareness, having a limited support network, a lack of time, and available resources and funding, which of course was reported by many people as a key problem. Unfortunately, none of these things are mentioned in any guidelines, or they're not really mentioned much in the literature at all. And so I think this highlights the significant importance of involving clinicians in the production of guidelines going forward. So overall, we found that although the clinical practice of cognitive rehabilitation is broadly consistent with guidelines, the guidelines are still limited in scope and quality of the evidence. So we still have a very long way to go in addressing the impediments to delivery of cognitive rehabilitation to enhance quality of life for people with brain injury. There have been no randomised controlled trials that have evaluated the impact of family or social support, of teamwork, or a focus on the individual, the key things that we all think are so important. Brain injuries are so complex and multifaceted that guidelines to implement treatments in a certain way will never apply across all injured individuals. It's much less about the treatment that's recommended than it is about the context and the manner in which it is implemented. So the key factors that we need to consider are: who is the person with a brain injury? What's the nature and severity of their difficulties? What's the client's level of awareness and motivation? We need to set individual goals and apply things directly to the real world of the client and include their perspective on how they are finding the intervention. We need to work as a team, and we need to form a close alliance with the client and the family in delivering interventions. And yes, as I already just said, we need to be involving the family. And above all, as we learnt from Kate and from so many others, that unfortunately rehabilitation is traditionally only available in the first year after brain injury. But these people are living with their difficulties forever. And so clinicians need to rethink the way they deliver interventions and know that what they're working with initially will need to be reinforced over very extended periods of time. So to achieve meaningful outcomes, all of these recommended therapies need to adhere to these principles. And above all, of course, there need to be the staffing and resources to support these interventions. Of course, we know that so many people in regional and rural areas have almost no access to cognitive rehabilitation. And so it's to this end that my colleague Renee Stolwick is working hard on working with regional centres in Victoria to communicate via Zoom and provide education and support to clinicians working in country areas, actually conduct neuropsychological assessments via Zoom, and they're validating this, and actually deliver cognitive, mood and behavioural interventions remotely. But in the end, the key take-home message, which I think is a take-home message in almost every talk I give, is that meaningful outcomes necessitate a focus on the individual, regardless of what any guideline says. So in closing, I'd just like to acknowledge my many colleagues from the Monash Epworth Rehabilitation Research Centre and the Transport Accident Commission, who have funded our longitudinal outcome study, which has underpinned all of our knowledge of the cognitive difficulties of our clients and since 1995. So thank you very much indeed.